What happened that Thursday evening at the Phoenix Police Academy would expose a truth so shocking that it would change everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet woman who cleaned their floors after hours. Samantha Rivera had perfected the art of being invisible. For 8 months, she had moved through the Phoenix Police Academy like a shadow, arriving each evening at exactly 6:30 p.m., with her gray custodial uniform perfectly pressed and her long black hair pulled back into a regulation bun that revealed nothing about who she really was. The security badge clipped to her collar identified her simply as S. Rivera, Custodial Services, but it told no one that the hands pushing that industrial mop had once steadied sniper rifles in the mountains of Afghanistan. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She preferred the night shift for reasons that went far beyond the pay differential. Fewer people meant fewer questions, fewer opportunities for someone to look too closely at the way she moved through the building, with the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of clearing hostile compounds. The recruits and instructors who occasionally passed her in the hallways saw exactly what she wanted them to see. Another working-class woman trying to make ends meet, invisible in the way that service workers often become to those they serve. The academy building held 340 rooms across 4 floors, and Samantha knew every inch of it. Not just the layout that custodial staff needed to know, but the structural weaknesses, the sight lines from every window, the locations of emergency equipment that wasn't marked on any civilian blueprint. She had memorized the building the same way she had once memorized forward operating bases in Kandahar province, because old habits from dangerous places die hard, even in supposedly safe environments. Her custodial cart contained the usual supplies: industrial cleaner, paper towels, trash bags, floor wax. But hidden beneath the false bottom were items that would have raised serious questions if anyone had discovered them. Emergency medical supplies that went far beyond basic first aid, a communication device that could reach frequencies unavailable to civilian radios, and detailed floor plans of every government building within a 50-mile radius. Samantha Rivera was not who she appeared to be, but she had very good reasons for maintaining that deception. The Phoenix Police Academy served as a regional training center for law enforcement agencies across Arizona. Recruits came from departments in Phoenix, Scottsdale, Tempe, Mesa, and dozens of smaller municipalities throughout the state. They trained in firearms, defensive tactics, emergency response, and community policing. Most of them were young men and women fresh out of college or the military, eager to serve their communities and prove themselves worthy of the badge. They had no idea that the woman who emptied their trash cans and mopped their classroom floors was more qualified than many of their instructors. Samantha's background check for the custodial position had come back clean because it was supposed to. The woman who existed in official records was exactly who she appeared to be: divorced mother of 1, high school education, previous experience in food service and retail. Her employment history showed a pattern of stable but unremarkable jobs, the kind of resume that hiring managers barely glanced at before filing away. There was no military service listed, no specialized training, no indication that she had ever been anywhere more dangerous than a shopping mall during Black Friday sales. But the truth was buried so deep in classified files that even most federal agencies couldn't access it. Staff Sergeant Samantha Rivera, 82nd Airborne Division, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Special Operations Liaison. Her military occupational specialty was officially listed as administrative support, but her real job had involved deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, where her ability to blend in and become forgettable had kept her alive in situations that had killed soldiers with far more obvious combat training. The tattoo that stretched across her shoulder blades told the real story. Inked in precise military detail, it depicted the distinctive wings and parachute of airborne qualification, surrounded by coordinates that marked every successful mission she had completed in hostile territory. Below the wings, in letters small enough that only someone very close could read them, were the words "Death from Above" in both English and Pashto. It was a piece of art that belonged on a warrior, not a woman who spent her nights pushing a mop through empty hallways. Her transition to civilian life had been deliberately orchestrated to make her disappear. After her unit was disbanded following a classified operation that officially never happened, Samantha had been given a choice: accept a desk job with full military honors, or vanished completely into a deep cover program that placed former special operations personnel in civilian positions where they could monitor potential threats to homeland security. She had chosen invisibility, partly because she wasn't ready to stop serving her country, and partly because she wasn't sure she knew how to be anything other than a soldier. The custodial job at the police academy was perfect cover. Law enforcement facilities were natural targets for domestic terrorists and foreign operatives looking to gather intelligence on American security procedures. By working there every night, Samantha could observe everyone who entered the building, monitor for suspicious activity, and maintain readiness to respond if a real threat ever materialized. Her handlers in the program received weekly reports that were always the same. No unusual activity detected. Facility secure. Subject maintaining cover successfully. For 8 months, her routine had been exactly the same. Clock in at 6:30 p.m., receive the daily assignment sheet from the facility supervisor, begin cleaning on the 4th floor and work her way down. The recruits were usually gone by 7 p.m., the instructors by 8 p.m., leaving her alone with the security guards who barely acknowledged her existence. She would finish the building by 2 a.m., submit her security report through encrypted channels, and drive home to her small apartment, where she would spend a few hours trying to sleep before picking up her 7-year-old daughter from school. Isabella was the one part of her cover story that was completely real. Born during Samantha's first deployment, Isabella had spent most of her early childhood living with her grandmother, while her mother served overseas. The divorce was also real, the result of a marriage that couldn't survive the stress of deployments and the secrets that Samantha could never share. Her ex-husband believed she worked nights because she couldn't find anything better, and she let him believe it because the truth would have endangered everyone she cared about. The other custodial workers accepted her the same way they accepted everyone, with polite indifference. She was reliable, quiet, and never caused problems. She didn't complain about the work assignments, didn't call in sick, and didn't participate in the workplace gossip that filled the break room during shift changes. They assumed she was probably undocumented or had some other reason for keeping a low profile. But in a city like Phoenix, that wasn't unusual enough to generate curiosity. The Academy's head of security, Lieutenant Marcus Torres, had noticed her attention to detail and professional demeanor, but in a positive way. She was the kind of employee who made his job easier, thorough, trustworthy, and invisible. Her background check had been routine, her references had checked out, and she had never given him any reason to look deeper into who she really was. If he had known that she noticed things about the building's security that even he missed, or that she could probably take down any 3 of his guards simultaneously, it might have changed his perspective considerably. But Samantha preferred it this way. Invisibility was safety, for her and for Isabella. The deep cover program paid well enough to support them both, and the work gave her a sense of purpose that civilian jobs had never provided. She was still serving, still protecting people, just in a way that no one could see. Her military training remained sharp through private practice sessions in the desert outside Phoenix, where she maintained the skills that might someday save lives, even though she hoped she would never need to use them. The academy building held secrets beyond the obvious ones. Late at night, when she was alone with her thoughts and her memories, Samantha sometimes caught herself thinking about the other people who worked there. The recruits reminded her of the young soldiers she had once led on dangerous missions, eager and idealistic and unprepared for how complicated the world really was. The instructors reminded her of her former commanding officers, experienced and cynical, and carrying the weight of too many difficult decisions. She wondered sometimes if any of them had secrets like hers, if any of them were more than they appeared to be. But mostly she focused on her work, her daughter, and maintaining the careful balance between her public identity and her private truth. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that a single evening would shatter her carefully constructed invisibility and force her to choose between maintaining her cover and saving the lives of people who had never bothered to learn her name. Thursday evening began like every other evening for the past 8 months. Samantha arrived at the Phoenix Police Academy at exactly 6:30 p.m., her beige Honda Civic pulling into the employee parking lot behind the main building where the custodial staff parked their cars. The Arizona sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of sunsets over the Hindu Kush, though she pushed those memories aside as she gathered her things and walked toward the employee entrance. The academy buzzed with its usual end-of-day activity. Recruit Class 2024C was finishing their final week of training, and the building hummed with nervous energy as 43 men and women prepared for their graduation ceremony scheduled for Saturday morning. These recruits had spent 16 weeks learning everything from constitutional law to defensive tactics, and now they were just days away from receiving their badges and beginning their careers in law enforcement across the Phoenix metropolitan area. In Classroom 4A, Sergeant William Hayes was conducting the final session of crisis management and emergency response, walking the recruits through scenarios they might encounter during their first year on patrol. The 28 students in his class listened intently as he described domestic violence calls, traffic accidents, and active shooter situations, taking notes that they hoped they would never need to use. Sergeant Hayes had been teaching at the academy for 12 years, and he prided himself on preparing recruits for the harsh realities of police work without destroying their idealism entirely. Down the hall in the firearms training simulation room, Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez was running final qualification tests for recruits who needed to improve their marksmanship scores before graduation. The computerized system projected realistic scenarios onto a large screen while recruits used modified service weapons to respond to simulated threats. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building as nervous recruits tried to demonstrate proficiency with their sidearms, knowing that failure here could delay their graduation by months. The administrative staff was preparing for the weekend's graduation ceremony, coordinating with families, local officials, and media representatives who would attend Saturday's event. Academy Director Colonel James Patterson had spent the afternoon reviewing the ceremony program and ensuring that everything was perfect for the recruits and their families. This graduation would be larger than usual, with several local television stations planning to broadcast portions of the ceremony live. In the Academy's main conference room, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Captain Dennis Morgan from the Phoenix Police Department was meeting with representatives from the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI to discuss a credible threat that had been received earlier that week. Intelligence indicated that a domestic terrorist group with anti-government sympathies had been monitoring police training facilities across the Southwest, possibly planning an attack designed to disrupt law enforcement operations and send a message about their opposition to federal authority. The threat was serious enough that federal agencies had recommended canceling the graduation ceremony, but Academy leadership had decided to proceed with enhanced security measures instead. Additional uniformed officers would be present during the ceremony, metal detectors would be installed at all entrances, and a bomb detection team would sweep the building Friday evening. Captain Morgan was coordinating these security enhancements while trying to maintain the celebratory atmosphere that graduation ceremonies deserved. Samantha received her daily assignment sheet from Maria Gonzalez, the night shift supervisor who had been working at the academy for 15 years. Maria handed out cleaning assignments with the efficient professionalism of someone who took pride in maintaining institutional standards, even if her work was largely invisible to the people who benefited from it. Tonight's assignment was routine: 4th floor classrooms and offices, 3rd floor administrative areas, 2nd floor gymnasium and locker rooms, 1st floor lobby and common areas. "Building's busier than usual tonight," Maria mentioned as she distributed supplies from the main custodial closet. "Graduation week always makes everyone crazy. Just stay out of their way and do your work. They'll be cleared out by 8 o'clock, and then we can get everything ready for tomorrow's setup." The other members of the night custodial crew were familiar faces with familiar routines. Roberto Cruz handled maintenance issues and trash collection throughout the building. Carmen Ruiz was responsible for the kitchen facilities and cafeteria areas. David Kim focused on restroom maintenance and supply restocking. They worked as an efficient team, each person knowing their responsibilities and executing them with minimal supervision or interaction. Samantha began her work on the 4th floor, starting with the classrooms where recruits had spent their final day of instruction. The whiteboards still showed diagrams from the day's lessons. Proper handcuffing techniques, radio communication protocols, and legal procedures for conducting traffic stops. She erased the boards methodically, wiped down the desks and chairs, emptied the trash cans, and swept the floors with the same attention to detail she had once applied to maintaining equipment in military barracks. The instructor offices on the 4th floor were mostly empty, but several lights remained on where faculty members were finishing paperwork or preparing for Friday's final examinations. She cleaned around them quietly, maintaining the invisible professionalism that had characterized her work for 8 months. Professor Janet Sullivan nodded politely as Samantha emptied her office trash can but didn't look up from the stack of papers she was grading. In Lieutenant Martinez's office, Samantha noticed tactical manuals and training materials that brought back memories of her own military instruction. Books on hostage negotiation, crowd control, and emergency response filled the shelves, reminding her of similar material she had studied during her special operations training. But she maintained her focus on her cleaning duties, refusing to let her past training show in her current work. The third-floor administrative areas were quieter, with most staff having left for the day. Director Patterson's office was locked, but the light underneath his door suggested he was still working late, probably reviewing final details for Saturday's ceremony. The main administrative staff had left behind the usual clutter of a busy workplace: coffee cups, scattered papers, and the detritus of a complex organization trying to manage multiple priorities simultaneously. Samantha worked through the administrative areas systematically, ensuring that everything would be clean and organized for Friday's activities. The academic dean's office contained stacks of recruit files and graduation materials. The Human Resources Department had employment records and background check documentation for new hires. The Public Relations Office was filled with press materials and ceremony programs for Saturday's event. In the building's main conference room, she could hear the muffled voices of Captain Morgan's security meeting, though she couldn't make out specific details of their discussion. The meeting room's windows were covered with drawn blinds, and the door was closed, but she could sense the tension and urgency in the voices inside. Her instincts, honed by years of operational experience, told her that something significant was being discussed, though she had no official reason to be curious about it. The second-floor gymnasium and locker facilities required more intensive cleaning, as they always did after a full day of physical training activities. The recruits had spent hours practicing defensive tactics, physical fitness routines, and emergency response procedures. Their equipment was neatly stored in designated areas, but the floors needed thorough cleaning and the locker rooms required complete sanitization. Samantha had noticed over the months that the physical training areas reminded her most strongly of her military experience. The smell of sweat and determination, the organized chaos of people pushing their physical limits, the camaraderie that developed among people facing shared challenges together. Sometimes she caught herself watching the recruits during their training sessions, remembering her own early days in the military when everything had seemed possible and the world had appeared much simpler than it really was. The first-floor lobby and common areas were the final stop on her nightly routine. These spaces saw the most traffic during the day, with recruits, instructors, visitors, and administrative staff constantly moving through them. The lobby's polished floors reflected the Academy's commitment to professional standards, and the display cases showcased the achievements of previous graduating classes and distinguished faculty members. By 8:30 p.m., the building had largely emptied except for security personnel and the custodial crew. The Academy's night security guards, Officer Thomas Bradley and Officer Sarah Chen, began their evening patrol routines, checking doors, monitoring alarm systems, and ensuring that the building remained secure throughout the night. They exchanged pleasant but brief greetings with the custodial staff, maintaining the professional but distant relationships that characterized most workplace interactions. Samantha finished her assigned areas by 10:45 p.m., slightly ahead of schedule, due to the lighter-than-usual foot traffic in most classrooms. She returned her supplies to the main custodial closet, completed her daily cleaning report, and prepared to begin the routine security sweep that she conducted every night as part of her real mission at the Academy. This was when her actual work began, though none of her colleagues knew it. As Samantha completed her official custodial duties and the building settled into its nighttime rhythm, her senses began picking up subtle irregularities that would have been invisible to civilian workers, but stood out clearly to someone with her background. The Academy felt different tonight, though she couldn't immediately identify what was triggering her instincts. Years of operating in hostile environments had taught her to trust these feelings, even when logic suggested everything was normal. The first anomaly appeared at 11:15 p.m. when she noticed an unusual vehicle in the visitor parking lot during her routine window check. A dark blue panel van with tinted windows sat in a space typically reserved for daytime visitors. But evening classes had ended hours ago, and no legitimate business should have brought visitors to the Academy after standard operating hours. The van's license plate was partially obscured by mud, and its positioning suggested the driver had deliberately chosen a spot with limited visibility from the main security office. Officer Bradley's patrol route had taken him past that parking area 30 minutes earlier, without any apparent notice of the vehicle, which concerned Samantha more than the van itself. Bradley was a competent security guard with 15 years of experience, and his failure to register the anomaly suggested either exceptional camouflage skills on the part of the van's occupants, or a level of distraction among security personnel that could indicate compromised alertness. Her training kicked in automatically as she began conducting what appeared to be routine cleaning activities while actually performing reconnaissance on the building's current status. Moving through the corridors with her custodial cart provided perfect cover for observing details that would have seemed suspicious if she had been wandering the halls without obvious purpose. The cart's squeaky wheel, which she had deliberately never repaired, served as an audible explanation for her presence anywhere in the building. In the main lobby, she noticed that the magazine rack near the visitor seating area had been disturbed. The publications were still arranged neatly, but someone with trained observation skills could see that they had been handled recently by someone looking for something specific. The arrangement pattern was slightly different from how the day-shift custodial staff typically left them, and there were faint fingerprint smudges on magazines that should have been pristine since yesterday's cleaning. The building's main entrance showed signs of recent activity that didn't match normal evening procedures. Scuff marks on the floor suggested that heavy equipment had been moved through the lobby, but the Academy's maintenance logs showed no scheduled deliveries or installations for this week. More concerning were the small pieces of black rubber near the door frames, the kind left behind by tactical boots with specialized soles designed for silent movement. Officer Chen's radio communications with the central monitoring station had become increasingly sporadic over the past hour, another deviation from standard protocol that raised red flags in Samantha's mind. Security guards typically checked in every 20 minutes during evening shifts, but Chen's last transmission had been at 10:32 p.m., and her radio had been silent since then, despite multiple attempts by the monitoring station to establish contact. In the fourth-floor corridor where she had begun her cleaning routine hours earlier, Samantha discovered evidence that someone had been in the instructor offices after hours. Door frames showed microscopic scratches consistent with lockpicks, and several office doors that she remembered being securely locked now showed signs of having been opened and carefully resecured. The intruders were professionals, skilled enough to leave minimal evidence, but not quite good enough to fool someone with her level of training. The tactical training materials in Lieutenant Martinez's office had been photographed, evidenced by the slight displacement of books and the presence of tiny fiber particles that suggested someone had been handling them with gloves. Intelligence gathering was the most likely motivation, but whether the targets were training procedures, student information, or facility security details remained unclear. The fact that nothing had been stolen suggested surveillance rather than simple theft. Captain Morgan's security meeting had ended at 9:45 p.m. according to the conference room scheduling display, but traces of conversation lingered in ways that indicated the discussion had been intense and probably classified. Coffee cups showed stress patterns from being gripped too tightly, and notepaper in the trash revealed indentations from heavy-handed writing, though the actual content had been shredded and removed. The building's fire safety systems had been tampered with in subtle ways that would disable them without triggering immediate alarms. Someone with detailed knowledge of the Academy's infrastructure had accessed utility areas and made precise modifications that would prevent proper emergency response if a crisis occurred. The modifications were sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but would fail catastrophically if actually needed. Samantha's communication device, hidden in her custodial cart beneath cleaning supplies, began receiving encrypted signals that indicated her handlers were aware of potential threats to the facility. The messages were brief and coded, but their frequency suggested heightened concern at levels far above local law enforcement. Federal agencies were monitoring the situation, though she had no way of knowing whether they were tracking the same anomalies she had observed. In the gymnasium, exercise equipment had been moved slightly from its normal positions, creating sight lines that didn't exist during standard operations. Someone had been studying the building's layout with tactical considerations in mind, identifying positions that would provide advantages during a potential confrontation. The changes were minimal enough to avoid detection by casual users, but significant enough to alter the room's defensive characteristics. The Academy's computer system showed signs of recent unauthorized access that had been carefully concealed. Network activity logs revealed data transfers during hours when no legitimate users should have been active, and security camera feeds had experienced brief interruptions that could have provided windows for undetected movement throughout the building. The infiltration was professional-grade, suggesting capabilities beyond typical criminal organizations. Emergency exit routes had been surveyed and possibly compromised. Several doors that should have provided quick evacuation paths showed evidence of hardware modification that would delay or prevent their use during a crisis. The sabotage was subtle but systematic, designed to channel people towards specific areas of the building if an emergency evacuation became necessary. Personnel files in the Human Resources Office had been accessed and copied, based on subtle changes in filing arrangements and the presence of photocopy machine residue on documents that shouldn't have been handled recently. The intruders were gathering intelligence on academy staff, student rosters, and possibly security procedures. Building profiles on potential targets was a standard precursor to more aggressive action. Officer Bradley's patrol route had been observed and mapped, evidenced by small marks on walls and door frames that indicated someone had been timing his movements and identifying predictable patterns. His security procedures, while adequate for normal circumstances, had been studied by people planning to exploit gaps in coverage. The Academy's night security was being treated as an obstacle to be bypassed rather than a deterrent to be avoided. The building's ventilation system had been accessed through maintenance areas that required specialized knowledge to locate and enter. Air filtration systems showed signs of modification that could indicate preparation for dispersing chemical or biological agents throughout the facility. The changes were sophisticated enough to require advanced technical knowledge and specialized equipment. Samantha realized that the Academy was being prepared for an attack that would likely occur during tomorrow's activities or Saturday's graduation ceremony. The infiltration was too systematic and professional to be random, and the timing coincided with the security briefing she had observed earlier. Multiple threat vectors were being established simultaneously, suggesting a coordinated operation by people with significant resources and planning capabilities. Her training protocols demanded immediate contact with her handlers, but communication while inside the building carried risks of detection if the infiltrators were monitoring electronic signals. She needed to assess the full scope of the threat before taking action that might compromise her position or endanger others. The situation required careful navigation between her cover identity and her operational responsibilities. The evidence was mounting that something significant would happen soon, and the Academy's normal security measures were inadequate to address professional-level threats. Samantha found herself in the familiar position of knowing more than she could reveal, seeing dangers that others couldn't recognize, and carrying responsibility for protecting people who had no idea they needed protection. Her careful surveillance had revealed a coordinated infiltration operation targeting the Academy, but she still didn't know when the attack would come, who was behind it, or what their ultimate objectives were. All she knew for certain was that the quiet evening shift was about to become much more complicated. The crisis erupted at exactly 11:47 p.m. when the building's main power grid experienced what appeared to be a system failure but was actually the first phase of a coordinated assault on the Phoenix Police Academy. Emergency lighting activated automatically, bathing the corridors in an eerie red glow that transformed familiar spaces into something threatening and unfamiliar. Samantha was on the second floor when the lights went out, and her military instincts immediately recognized that this was not a routine power outage. Within seconds of the blackout, the building's communication systems went dead. Officer Bradley's radio crackled with static before falling silent, cutting off his attempt to report the power failure to the central monitoring station. The Academy's landline phones produced no dial tone, and cellular service throughout the building had been jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. The facility was now completely isolated from outside assistance, exactly as the infiltrators had planned. The emergency generator that should have restored full power within 30 seconds failed to activate, confirming Samantha's growing suspicion that the Academy was under attack by people who had thoroughly studied its infrastructure and systematically disabled its defenses. Someone had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, identifying and neutralizing every backup system that might have allowed the facility to call for help or maintain operational security. Smoke began pouring into the building through the ventilation system, thick and acrid, with the smell of burning chemicals that immediately triggered Samantha's recognition of military-grade smoke grenades. This wasn't a fire or an accident. It was a deliberate tactic designed to create confusion, limit visibility, and force people to evacuate through predetermined routes where they could be controlled or eliminated. The smoke was too dense and too uniform to be accidental. At 11:49 p.m., armed figures dressed in black tactical gear emerged from concealed positions throughout the academy. They moved with military precision through corridors they had clearly studied in advance, their night vision equipment giving them significant advantages in the darkened building. Samantha counted at least 8 individuals from her position near the second-floor stairwell, though she suspected there were more operating in areas she couldn't observe. The first casualties occurred in the main security office, where Officer Chen was overwhelmed before she could activate any alarm systems. The attackers had timed their assault perfectly, striking during the brief window when both security guards were separated on their patrol routes and unable to provide mutual support. Chen's muffled cry for help echoed briefly through the corridor before being cut short in a way that suggested professional neutralization techniques. Officer Bradley attempted to reach the security office when he lost radio contact with his partner, but found his path blocked by armed figures who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the building. His service weapon proved inadequate against attackers wearing military-grade body armor and using superior tactics. The sound of his struggle carried through the ventilation system before ending abruptly, leaving Samantha with the knowledge that the Academy's security force had been neutralized within minutes. Captain Morgan, who had been working late in his temporary office to finalize security arrangements for Saturday's graduation ceremony, found himself trapped on the 3rd floor as smoke filled the corridors and armed figures secured key positions throughout the building. His attempts to use his cell phone were blocked by the electronic jamming, and his escape routes had been systematically cut off by attackers who knew exactly where he would try to go. The attackers began systematically searching the building for specific targets, moving room by room with the efficiency of people following a detailed plan. They weren't random terrorists or opportunistic criminals. They were professionals executing a mission that had been planned with military precision. Their communications were coordinated through encrypted radio systems that indicated significant financial backing and technical sophistication. In the administrative offices, file cabinets were being opened and specific documents removed while other materials were scattered to create the appearance of random vandalism. The selectivity of their document theft suggested they were after specific intelligence about law enforcement training procedures, student information, or upcoming security arrangements. This was espionage disguised as terrorism, or terrorism with espionage objectives. Samantha realized that the graduation ceremony had been the real target all along. With families, local officials, and media representatives scheduled to attend Saturday's event, the Academy would be filled with high-value targets and symbolic significance. Tonight's operation was likely reconnaissance and preparation for a much larger attack that would occur when the building was packed with innocent civilians. The chemical smoke was becoming thicker and more toxic, designed not just to obscure vision but to incapacitate anyone who remained in the building too long. Samantha recognized the symptoms of exposure beginning to affect her: burning eyes, difficulty breathing, and the disorientation that came from inhaling military-grade crowd control agents. The attackers were wearing protective equipment while their victims were defenseless against the chemical assault. Director Patterson had been working in his office when the attack began and now found himself trapped as armed figures took control of the administrative floor. His attempts to activate the building's emergency lockdown procedures were blocked by the systematic sabotage that had preceded the assault. The Academy's defensive systems had been turned against it, creating a trap rather than protection for anyone inside. Faculty members who had stayed late to prepare for Friday's final examinations found themselves caught in a nightmare that their law enforcement training had taught them to expect, but never fully prepared them to experience. Professor Sullivan barricaded herself in her office as footsteps and muffled commands echoed through the corridors outside. Lieutenant Martinez discovered that her tactical training materials had been the target of the earlier break-ins when she found her office being systematically searched by professionals. The attackers were using the building's own infrastructure against its occupants, forcing people towards specific areas where they could be controlled or eliminated efficiently. Emergency exits had been blocked or booby-trapped, stairwells were monitored by armed guards, and the elevator systems had been disabled to prevent vertical movement between floors. Everyone inside was being herded like livestock toward predetermined collection points. The kitchen and cafeteria areas had been converted into a staging area where the attackers were setting up equipment for the next phase of their operation. Explosive devices were being positioned with the precision of people who understood the building's structural weak points, while communication equipment was being installed to coordinate with external elements of their organization. This was clearly the preliminary phase of a much larger operation. Recruit class members who had been using the library and study areas for last-minute preparation found themselves trapped in a situation that exceeded anything they had learned about in their crisis management training. These future police officers were discovering that textbook knowledge was inadequate preparation for facing professional killers who had every advantage of surprise, superior equipment, and detailed planning. The attackers' coordination suggested extensive surveillance and planning that had been ongoing for weeks or months. They knew the building's layout, the security procedures, the personnel schedules, and the locations of every system that could aid or hinder their operation. This level of preparation indicated resources and capabilities associated with state-sponsored terrorism or highly sophisticated criminal organizations. Samantha found herself in the impossible position of being the only person in the building with the training and experience necessary to counter this level of threat. But doing so would require abandoning her carefully maintained cover and revealing capabilities that were supposed to remain secret. Her handlers had prepared her for many scenarios, but not for choosing between maintaining operational security and preventing a massacre. The smoke was thickening to dangerous levels, and she could hear the sounds of people being captured and moved to central locations where they could be controlled more easily. Time was running out for everyone trapped in the building, and traditional law enforcement response would be inadequate against attackers with this level of sophistication and preparation. She realized that the custodial worker named Samantha Rivera was about to die one way or another. Either she would maintain her cover and watch innocent people be slaughtered, or she would reveal her true capabilities and sacrifice everything she had built over 8 months of careful invisibility. The choice was becoming unavoidable, and hesitation would cost lives that she had the power to save. Samantha crouched in the second-floor supply closet, her heart pounding as she listened to the methodical footsteps of armed attackers moving through the corridor just outside the door. The chemical smoke had grown so thick that breathing without protection was becoming dangerous, and she could hear the muffled sounds of people being rounded up and forced toward the main assembly areas. Every instinct screamed at her to act, but 8 months of maintaining her cover warred against a lifetime of military training that demanded immediate intervention. The encrypted communication device hidden in her custodial cart was receiving urgent signals from her handlers, but she couldn't risk responding while hostile forces were actively searching the building. The brief bursts of coded transmission indicated that federal agencies were aware of the situation, but external response would take time that the people trapped inside didn't have. She was the only asset in position to make a difference, but using her capabilities would end her deep cover assignment permanently. Through the thin walls of the supply closet, she could hear Captain Morgan being forced down the hallway at gunpoint, his voice strained as he tried to negotiate with his captors. The attackers weren't interested in conversation. They were moving him toward whatever collection point they had established for high-value targets. His law enforcement experience was useless against professionals who had planned for every contingency and held every advantage. Director Patterson's voice echoed from somewhere on the 3rd floor, demanding to know what the attackers wanted and threatening them with federal prosecution for assault on a law enforcement facility. His words were met with harsh laughter and commands in accented English that suggested international involvement in the operation. These weren't domestic terrorists. They were foreign operatives conducting a sophisticated intelligence and psychological warfare mission on American soil. The sounds of systematic destruction drifted through the building as the attackers continued their work. Computer equipment was being destroyed or stolen, files were being photographed or taken, and explosive charges were being placed with the precision of people who understood exactly how to bring down the structure most effectively. This wasn't random violence. It was the methodical elimination of a target that represented American law enforcement capabilities. Samantha's military training provided her with tactical assessments that civilian survivors couldn't make. She estimated 8 to 12 attackers based on movement patterns and communication frequencies, all equipped with professional-grade weapons, body armor, and night vision equipment. They were operating with coordination that indicated extensive rehearsal and command structure. Most critically, they were following a timeline that suggested this was preliminary to a larger operation. The chemical smoke was designed to do more than obscure vision and cause disorientation. As it continued to thicken, She recognized the symptoms of exposure that would eventually cause unconsciousness and potentially death if people remained inside much longer. The attackers were wearing protective equipment while their victims were being systematically poisoned, creating a time limit that made immediate action essential for survival. Isabella's face flashed through her mind as she weighed her impossible options. Her daughter was safe at home with a babysitter, unaware that her mother was facing a choice that would determine whether she remained the invisible custodial worker who picked her up from school every day, or became someone whose identity would be scrutinized by federal agencies and potentially exposed to dangerous people who might use a child as leverage. The deep cover program had cost her everything already: her military career, her marriage, her ability to maintain normal relationships or live an honest life. She had sacrificed 8 years of her life to serve her country in ways that would never be acknowledged or recognized. Now she was being asked to sacrifice even more, to give up the fragile stability she had built for herself and Isabella in exchange for the lives of people who had never bothered to learn her name. But the alternative was watching innocent people die when she had the power to save them. Faculty members who had dedicated their careers to training the next generation of law enforcement officers. Recruits who had spent months preparing to serve their communities. Security guards who were just trying to do their jobs and support their families. All of them were about to become victims of an attack that she could prevent if she was willing to pay the price. Her hands moved automatically to the false bottom of her custodial cart, retrieving equipment that had waited 8 months for this moment. The tactical vest folded beneath cleaning supplies. The communication gear that could reach frequencies beyond civilian capabilities. The sidearm that was registered to an identity that didn't officially exist. The medical supplies that could treat injuries beyond basic first aid. Everything she needed to become someone other than Samantha Rivera, custodial worker. The decision crystallized as she heard Professor Sullivan's terrified voice from somewhere on the 4th floor, pleading with attackers who showed no interest in mercy or negotiation. These were people who had families, dreams, and responsibilities, just like she did. They deserved the chance to go home to their loved ones, to continue their work, to live the lives they had chosen. She couldn't stand by and watch them be slaughtered for the sake of maintaining a cover identity that had already cost her too much. Samantha Rivera, the invisible woman who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans, began to die in that supply closet. In her place, Staff Sergeant Samantha Rivera of the 82nd Airborne Division prepared to take back control of a situation that civilian responses couldn't handle. The transformation was both physical and psychological, as 8 months of practiced invisibility gave way to years of combat training and operational experience. Her movements became precise and controlled as she stripped away the custodial uniform that had been her disguise and donned the tactical gear that revealed her true capabilities. The process was familiar and automatic. Muscle memory from hundreds of similar preparations in hostile territory, where hesitation meant death and indecision killed innocent people. She was returning to her real identity for the first time in 8 months. The tattoo across her shoulder blade seemed to come alive as she prepared for action, the airborne wings and mission coordinates reminding her of who she really was beneath the carefully constructed facade. Each mark represented lives saved, objectives accomplished, and impossible missions completed against overwhelming odds. Tonight would add another chapter to that history, regardless of the personal cost. She activated her communication device and sent a brief encrypted message to her handlers: "Cover blown. Engaging hostiles. Protect Isabella." The response came back immediately, with authorization codes that gave her operational freedom and promised that her daughter would be secured by Federal Protection Services within the hour. The deep cover program was officially ending, but her real mission was just beginning. The sound of breaking glass from the main lobby indicated that the attackers were beginning the final phase of their operation, whatever that might be. External reinforcements might be arriving, or they might be preparing for mass casualties among their captives. Either way, time had run out for careful planning and measured responses. Action was required immediately, and she was the only person in position to provide it. As she prepared to leave the supply closet and engage an unknown number of professional killers, Samantha allowed herself one last thought about the quiet life she was giving up. Tomorrow, Isabella would wake up to discover that her mother was someone completely different from the woman who had tucked her into bed. There would be questions that couldn't be answered, changes that couldn't be explained, and a future that would be determined by federal agencies rather than personal choices. But tonight, people were going to live because she was willing to sacrifice everything else. Samantha emerged from the supply closet transformed into someone the attackers couldn't have anticipated. Gone was the invisible custodial worker who had moved through the academy unnoticed for 8 months. In her place stood a combat veteran with specialized training in hostage rescue, building clearance, and neutralizing superior forces through tactical superiority and intimate knowledge of the operational environment. The transformation was so complete that even her posture and movement patterns had changed entirely. Her first priority was establishing communication with any surviving academy personnel while gathering intelligence on the attackers' positions and objectives. Using hand signals and movement techniques learned in Afghanistan, she made her way through the smoke-filled corridors toward the main security office, where the building's central monitoring systems could provide tactical information about hostile locations and survivor positions throughout the facility. The security office had been ransacked, but the attackers had focused on disabling communication equipment rather than destroying the internal surveillance systems that Samantha knew how to access through backup protocols. Working quickly with the expertise of someone who had breached similar facilities in hostile territory, she brought the monitoring network back online using emergency power sources that the infiltrators hadn't discovered. Multiple screens flickered to life, revealing the full scope of the assault. 12 armed attackers were systematically moving through the building, herding survivors toward the main gymnasium where they were being held under guard. The coordination was professional grade, with each team member following specific assignments that indicated extensive rehearsal and detailed planning. This wasn't opportunistic violence, it was a precisely executed military operation. Captain Morgan, Director Patterson, and 8 other academy personnel were being held in the gymnasium under the supervision of 3 armed guards. The captives appeared uninjured but were clearly terrified, sitting on the floor with their hands visible while their captors prepared equipment that looked disturbingly like explosive devices. The timeline suggested that mass casualties were planned for the near future, possibly timed to coincide with external events. Through the surveillance system, Samantha identified the attackers' command structure and communication patterns. The leader appeared to be a tall man, with tactical gear bearing foreign military insignia, coordinating the operation through encrypted radio communications in what sounded like Eastern European accents. His subordinates moved with the discipline of former Special Forces personnel, suggesting this was a state-sponsored operation rather than terrorism by criminal organizations. Her tactical assessment revealed both advantages and challenges. The attackers held superior numbers, better equipment, and controlled the building's main access points, but they had planned for resistance from civilian security personnel, not from someone with her specialized training. Their positioning assumed they were facing untrained victims rather than a combat veteran who knew the facility better than they did and could move through areas they hadn't secured. Using maintenance corridors and utility spaces that weren't marked on standard building plans, Samantha began moving toward positions where she could engage isolated attackers without alerting the main force. Her knowledge of the Academy's infrastructure, gained through 8 months of custodial work, provided advantages that no amount of external surveillance could have given the hostile force. She knew every hidden passage, every structural weakness, every system that could be used tactically. The first engagement occurred near the 4th-floor stairwell, where a lone attacker was monitoring the corridor while his teammates searched faculty offices. Samantha approached from behind using sound discipline learned in mountain warfare, where detection meant death for entire units. The neutralization was swift and silent, accomplished with techniques that left no doubt about her military background. The attacker's equipment and communication gear were quickly appropriated for intelligence purposes. His radio communications revealed that the operation was proceeding on schedule toward a deadline that was approximately 40 minutes away. References to external coordination and media notifications suggested that whatever they planned for the hostages was intended to be broadcast or recorded for propaganda purposes. The graduation ceremony had been a cover. The real objective was creating a spectacle that would terrorize American law enforcement and demonstrate the vulnerability of domestic security installations. Moving through the building's ventilation system with expertise gained from clearing compounds in urban warfare environments, Samantha repositioned herself to observe the main gymnasium where the hostages were being held. The explosive devices being prepared were sophisticated enough to bring down significant portions of the building, ensuring maximum casualties and symbolic destruction. The attackers intended to eliminate everyone inside and leave behind a message about American weakness. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Her communication device finally connected with federal response teams who were staged outside the building but unable to breach, without risking massive casualties among the hostages. The attackers had chosen their timing and methods specifically to prevent traditional law enforcement responses, creating a situation where external intervention would likely result in the deaths of everyone inside. Only someone already in position could change the tactical equation. The second engagement occurred when she intercepted two attackers moving between floors to coordinate with their command element. Using the building's layout to create an ambush position, she eliminated both targets, using close-quarters combat techniques that emphasized speed and silence over firepower. Their equipment provided additional intelligence about the operation's timeline and revealed that backup plans existed for multiple contingencies. Radio intercepts indicated that the leader was becoming concerned about the loss of communication with his perimeter guards, but hadn't yet realized that he was facing organized resistance rather than equipment failures. Samantha used this confusion to her advantage, moving through areas the attackers considered secure while gathering intelligence about their remaining positions and capabilities. In the administrative offices, she discovered that the attackers had been photographing sensitive documents related to federal law enforcement training programs, anti-terrorism procedures, and interagency cooperation protocols. This was espionage combined with terrorism, designed to gather intelligence, while simultaneously striking a psychological blow against American security institutions. The information they were stealing could compromise law enforcement operations across multiple states. Her tactical vest, revealed for the first time since beginning her deep cover assignment, displayed the subdued insignia of units that didn't officially exist and operations that had never been acknowledged. The airborne wings tattooed across her shoulder blades seemed to pulse with renewed significance as she moved through the building with the confidence of someone who had survived much worse situations in places where backup was impossible and failure meant death. The third engagement required more sophisticated tactics when she encountered a team of 3 attackers securing the main entrance. Using explosive devices appropriated from neutralized hostiles, she created diversions that separated the team and allowed her to eliminate them individually without alerting the main force. The techniques were textbook special operations, executed with the precision that came from years of similar missions in hostile territory. By now, the surviving attackers were beginning to realize that their carefully planned operation was being systematically dismantled by an unknown force. Radio communications revealed growing panic and confusion as teams failed to report and equipment disappeared from secured positions. The leader's voice was becoming strained as he tried to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. Samantha had reduced the hostile force from 12 attackers to 6, but the remaining targets were concentrated around the gymnasium where innocent people were being held at gunpoint. The final phase would require direct assault on a prepared position, with civilians in the line of fire and explosive devices that could be detonated if the attackers realized their operation was compromised. This was the kind of scenario that had made her reputation in Afghanistan, where impossible rescues were just another day's work. The tattooed coordinates on her spine seemed to burn as she prepared for the assault that would either save everyone in the building or result in the deaths of innocent people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when professionals decided to make a statement about American vulnerability. The final assault on the gymnasium required precision that bordered on perfection. Samantha positioned herself in the maintenance crawlspace above the basketball court, where 8 months of custodial work had taught her exactly which ceiling tiles could be removed silently and which support beams would hold her weight during rapid movement. Through the gaps in the suspended ceiling, she could observe 6 remaining attackers positioned around 11 hostages who sat in organized rows with their hands visible and their faces reflecting the terror of people who understood they were about to die. The explosive devices had been arranged in a pattern that would bring down the entire gymnasium section of the building, creating maximum structural damage and ensuring that no one inside could survive the blast. Detonation controls were being held by the operations leader, a man whose tactical gear bore the insignia of foreign military units that specialized in psychological warfare operations. His positioning near the hostages made direct engagement impossible without risking civilian casualties. Through her appropriated radio equipment, Samantha monitored the attackers' communications as they coordinated with external elements for the final phase of their operation. News crews were being alerted to arrive at specific times, government officials were receiving anonymous tips about an unfolding crisis, and social media accounts were being prepared to broadcast footage of the destruction. The entire event was choreographed for maximum propaganda impact. Captain Morgan had positioned himself protectively near the younger academy personnel, his law enforcement training evident in the way he scanned for opportunities to shield others despite his own desperate situation. Director Patterson was attempting to negotiate with the attackers, offering himself as a more valuable hostage in exchange for releasing the staff and faculty members. His efforts were being ignored by professionals who had no interest in bargaining or showing mercy. Professor Sullivan sat next to Lieutenant Martinez, both women trying to provide comfort to recruit trainers who were barely out of college themselves and had never imagined facing execution in what should have been the safest possible environment. Their quiet conversations revealed prayers and final messages for family members, the kind of last words that people whisper when they know death is approaching and want to ensure their love reaches beyond their final moments. Samantha's tactical assessment identified a narrow window of opportunity that would require split-second timing and absolute precision. The attackers' positioning created brief moments when their attention focused on specific areas, leaving gaps in their coverage that could be exploited by someone with her training. The approach would have to be simultaneous and overwhelming, preventing any of them from triggering the explosive devices or harming hostages during the engagement. Her communication device connected briefly with federal response teams who had finally positioned snipers around the building's perimeter, but external shots through the gymnasium windows would likely trigger immediate retaliation against the hostages. The assault had to come from inside, executed by someone who could neutralize multiple targets before they could react. Traditional hostage rescue protocols were inadequate for this situation. Moving through the ceiling space with the silence of someone who had infiltrated enemy positions in Afghanistan's mountain caves, Samantha positioned explosive charges at strategic points that would create maximum disorientation without bringing down the building's structure. The devices were set for simultaneous detonation, designed to stun the attackers while providing cover for her entry into the gymnasium through multiple access points. The coordinates tattooed on her spine seemed to guide her movements as she prepared for an assault that would either save 11 innocent lives or result in a massacre that would haunt American law enforcement for decades. Each mission coordinate represented a successful operation where impossible odds had been overcome through superior training, tactical planning, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the completion of the objective. At exactly 12:47 a.m., Samantha triggered the diversionary explosions that shattered windows, disabled lighting systems, and filled the gymnasium with smoke and debris that concealed her rapid descent from the ceiling. The attackers' night vision equipment was overwhelmed by the sudden changes in lighting and atmospheric conditions, giving her precious seconds of advantage during the most critical phase of the engagement. Her assault was systematic and ruthless, targeting the attackers in order of their threat to the hostages rather than their danger to herself. The leader with the detonation controls was neutralized first, his finger prevented from triggering the explosive devices by techniques learned in close-quarters combat against similarly equipped enemies. His radio equipment was immediately appropriated to prevent communication with external elements of the operation. The second and third targets were eliminated using movement patterns that kept hostages out of the line of fire, while maintaining constant pressure on the remaining attackers. Samantha's training had emphasized speed and violence of action in hostage situations, where hesitation or mercy could result in innocent deaths. The techniques were brutal but effective, designed to end threats permanently before they could adapt or retaliate. Captain Morgan recognized professional military action when he saw it and immediately began moving hostages toward cover positions, his law enforcement experience proving valuable in supporting the rescue operation. Director Patterson followed his lead, helping faculty members reach protected areas while the remaining attackers struggled to respond to an assault that exceeded their training and preparation. The fourth attacker attempted to use Professor Sullivan as a human shield, but Samantha's precision shooting skills, honed through thousands of hours of practice in conditions far more challenging than this, allowed her to neutralize the threat without endangering the hostage. The shot placement was textbook special operations, demonstrating capabilities that definitely didn't belong to a custodial worker. Lieutenant Martinez stared in shock as the quiet woman who had cleaned her office every night for 8 months moved through the gymnasium with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this many times before in much more dangerous circumstances. The transformation was so complete that it seemed impossible they could be the same person, yet the evidence was undeniable as the rescue operation unfolded with professional precision. The fifth and sixth attackers were eliminated, using tactics that combined room clearance techniques with hostage rescue protocols, ensuring that no civilian was endangered during the final moments of the engagement. Samantha's movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no motion or ammunition while systematically neutralizing threats that had seemed insurmountable just minutes earlier. When the smoke cleared and the gymnasium lights were restored, 11 Academy personnel sat in stunned silence while Samantha Rivera stood among the bodies of their attackers. No longer the invisible custodial worker they had barely noticed, but clearly someone with capabilities that defied explanation. Her tactical vest displayed subdued military insignia that most of them didn't recognize, and her movements revealed training that exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The explosive devices were quickly disarmed, using techniques that demonstrated extensive experience with military ordnance, preventing the destruction that would have eliminated everyone in the building. Federal response teams finally entered the facility to find the crisis resolved and the attackers neutralized by someone who shouldn't have possessed such capabilities. Director Patterson was the first to find his voice, asking the question that everyone wanted answered, "Who are you?" But Samantha was already removing her tactical gear and preparing to face consequences that would change everything about her carefully constructed life. The rescue was complete, but her cover was permanently blown. The quiet custodial worker who had mopped floors and emptied trash cans was gone forever, replaced by a combat veteran whose secret had been revealed in the most dramatic way possible. There would be no returning to invisibility after this night. The aftermath of the gymnasium rescue brought chaos of a different kind, as federal agencies descended on the Phoenix Police Academy like a coordinated invasion force. Within 20 minutes of the last attacker being neutralized, the building was swarming with FBI agents, Department of Homeland Security investigators, and personnel from agencies whose names were never spoken aloud in public settings. The crime scene was being processed with the intensity reserved for events that threatened national security rather than local law enforcement facilities. Samantha found herself at the center of an investigation that she had hoped never to experience. The deep cover program that had been her life for 8 months was being systematically exposed as federal investigators tried to understand how a custodial worker had single-handedly defeated a professional terrorist cell equipped with military-grade weapons and sophisticated operational planning. Her carefully constructed identity was being dismantled piece by piece under the scrutiny of people who specialized in finding hidden truths. Special Agent Patricia Vance from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division led the interrogation, her questions revealing that federal agencies had been monitoring the academy for weeks without realizing that one of their own assets was already in position. The disconnect between different intelligence operations had nearly resulted in disaster, with multiple agencies working at cross purposes while a coordinated attack unfolded under their noses. Samantha's intervention had prevented an intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions. Director Patterson sat in stunned silence as investigators explained that his custodial worker was actually Staff Sergeant Samantha Rivera, a decorated combat veteran with specialized training in counterterrorism operations and deep cover infiltration. The woman who had quietly cleaned his office every night for 8 months possessed qualifications that exceeded those of most federal agents, yet she had remained invisible to everyone around her until the moment crisis demanded her revelation. Captain Morgan's initial shock was giving way to professional curiosity as he processed the implications of what he had witnessed. The tactical precision of the gymnasium assault had been beyond anything he had seen in his law enforcement career, executed with a level of competence that suggested extensive experience in similar situations. His questions about her background were being deflected by federal investigators, who clearly knew more than they were willing to discuss. The surviving Academy personnel were being debriefed separately to prevent coordination of their statements, but their accounts were remarkably consistent in describing a transformation that seemed impossible. Professor Sullivan kept repeating that the woman who saved them bore no resemblance to the quiet custodial worker who had been part of the background for months. Lieutenant Martinez was struggling to reconcile her memories of routine interactions with someone who had clearly been evaluating the facility's security vulnerabilities. Samantha's real identity was emerging through classified databases that required security clearances above the level of most investigators. Her military record revealed 3 combat deployments with the 82nd Airborne Division, specialized training in hostage rescue and building clearance operations, and commendations for actions that had never been publicly acknowledged. The coordinates tattooed on her spine corresponded to classified mission locations, where American personnel had been extracted from impossible situations. The deep cover program itself was being investigated as federal officials tried to understand why Samantha had been placed at the academy without coordination with other security agencies. Her assignment had been part of a broader initiative to monitor potential threats to law enforcement facilities, but the program's existence was known only to a small number of officials with the highest security clearances. Most investigators were learning about it for the first time. Agent Vance revealed that the attackers had been identified as members of a foreign intelligence service that specialized in destabilizing American security institutions through high-profile attacks designed for maximum psychological impact. Their equipment and documentation indicated months of preparation and significant financial backing from hostile governments seeking to demonstrate American vulnerability. The Academy had been selected specifically for its symbolic value and media potential. The interrogation revealed that Samantha's cover assignment had actually prevented the gathering of intelligence that the attackers needed for their operation. Her presence in the building had forced them to modify their plans and rely on less complete information about security procedures and personnel schedules. Without her unknowing interference, the attack would have been even more devastating and difficult to counter. Media outlets were already broadcasting news of the thwarted attack, but official statements were carefully avoiding any mention of Samantha's role in the rescue operation. Federal agencies were working to maintain operational security around the deep cover program while acknowledging that a custodial worker had somehow managed to defeat a professional terrorist cell. The contradiction was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain under media scrutiny. Isabella's safety had been secured by federal protection services who were explaining to a confused 7-year-old that her mother's job was more complicated than they had previously discussed. The child was being cared for by specially trained personnel while investigators determined whether her identity had been compromised by the night's events. Samantha's greatest fear was that her daughter would become a target for retaliation by hostile intelligence services. The evidence recovered from the attackers revealed the scope of their intelligence-gathering operation, which had extended far beyond the Phoenix Police Academy to include law enforcement facilities across the Southwest. Training procedures, personnel information, and security protocols had been systematically collected in preparation for a coordinated series of attacks designed to cripple American law enforcement capabilities. Samantha's intervention had disrupted months of preparation. Her handlers from the Deep Cover program were conducting their own parallel investigation, trying to determine how much of the operation's security had been compromised by the night's events. The program's effectiveness depended on maintaining the anonymity of its operatives, but Samantha's dramatic rescue had made her the most visible deep cover agent in the program's history. Her usefulness for future covert operations had been permanently compromised. The gymnasium where the rescue had taken place was being processed like an archaeological site, with investigators documenting every detail of the tactical operation. Ballistics evidence, positioning analysis, and timeline reconstruction were revealing the precision of Samantha's assault and confirming that she had executed the rescue with minimal risk to civilian hostages. The professionalism of her actions was being studied as a textbook example of hostage rescue operations. Academy personnel were struggling to process the revelation that someone they had barely noticed possessed capabilities that exceeded those of most federal agents. The cognitive dissonance was particularly acute for faculty members who taught courses in tactical operations and emergency response, yet had failed to recognize a genuine expert who had been working among them for months. Their assumptions about service workers and invisible people were being fundamentally challenged. The attackers' communication equipment revealed ongoing contact with external elements that had planned to broadcast footage of the massacre for propaganda purposes. News crews had been alerted to arrive at specific times to document the destruction, and social media accounts were prepared to distribute graphic content designed to terrorize American law enforcement personnel. Samantha's intervention had prevented a psychological warfare operation of significant scope. Federal investigators were discovering that the attack on the academy had been intended as the opening move in a larger campaign targeting law enforcement training facilities across multiple states. Similar operations were being planned for police academies in Texas, California, and Florida, all designed to occur within a compressed time frame that would overwhelm federal response capabilities. The intelligence gathered during the Phoenix operation was supposed to refine tactics for subsequent attacks. Agent Vance concluded her interrogation with the acknowledgement that Samantha's actions had prevented not just a local tragedy but a national security crisis that could have fundamentally altered American law enforcement training procedures. The Deep Cover program had succeeded beyond its designers' expectations, but at the cost of exposing one of its most valuable operatives. The program itself would now face scrutiny that could compromise other ongoing operations. The quiet custodial worker who had cleaned floors and emptied trash cans was being transformed into a classified legend whose real story would never be fully told to the public, but whose actions had prevented an attack that could have changed the trajectory of American counterterrorism efforts. The personal cost of Samantha's heroic revelation became devastatingly clear within 48 hours of the Academy rescue. Federal investigators delivered the news that her deep cover identity had been irreparably compromised, not just locally but across multiple intelligence networks that had been monitoring the Phoenix operation. Foreign intelligence services now possessed detailed information about her capabilities, her methods, and most critically, her connection to Isabella. The 8-year program that had defined her adult life was ending in the most public way possible. Isabella's confused questions about why strangers were suddenly living in their apartment and why they couldn't go to familiar places broke Samantha's heart in ways that enemy bullets never could. The little girl who had known her mother as a quiet woman who worked nights cleaning buildings was struggling to understand explanations about dangerous people and protective custody that made no sense in her 7-year-old world. Their normal life of school pickups, homework help, and bedtime stories had been shattered by circumstances beyond either of their control. The financial implications were immediate and severe. The Deep Cover program provided substantial compensation for operatives who sacrificed normal careers and relationships to serve in classified positions, but termination meant the loss of income, benefits, and the specialized support systems that had made their lifestyle possible. Samantha found herself facing unemployment with skills that couldn't be listed on civilian resumes and experience that couldn't be discussed in job interviews. Media attention was becoming a constant threat despite federal efforts to control the narrative surrounding the Academy incident. Investigative journalists were asking uncomfortable questions about the mysterious custodial worker who had somehow defeated professional terrorists, and social media speculation was growing more dangerous each day. Photographs of Samantha entering and leaving federal buildings were being circulated online, making her recognizable to people who might have hostile intentions toward American intelligence operatives. The psychological transition from invisible operative to exposed veteran was proving more difficult than any combat deployment she had survived. For 8 years, Samantha had defined herself through secrecy, mission accomplishment, and the ability to blend into civilian environments without detection. Her identity had been built around capabilities that she couldn't reveal and achievements that couldn't be acknowledged. Now she was being forced to become visible in ways that felt fundamentally wrong. Her relationship with Isabella was being strained by security requirements that prevented normal activities and social interactions. The child couldn't attend her regular school, play with neighborhood friends, or maintain the routines that had provided stability during their unconventional lifestyle. Federal protection meant constant supervision by strangers who, despite their professionalism, couldn't replace the normalcy that had been lost when Samantha chose to reveal her true capabilities. The Phoenix Police Academy was implementing new security procedures based on lessons learned from the attack, but the changes served as constant reminders of the night that had changed everything. Director Patterson had requested meetings to discuss Samantha's potential role in developing enhanced training programs, but federal agencies were discouraging any public association between the academy and a former deep cover operative whose identity remained partially classified. Sleep became increasingly elusive as Samantha struggled with the knowledge that her decision to save 11 people had potentially endangered the one person who mattered most to her. Isabella's safety had always been her primary concern, but the protective measures now surrounding them felt like punishment for doing the right thing. The apartment that had been their refuge was now a monitored environment where privacy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Professional counselors specializing in intelligence operatives were trying to help her process the transition, but their standard protocols were designed for agents who retired normally rather than those whose covers had been blown during dramatic public incidents. The psychological frameworks for handling exposure didn't account for the unique stresses of single motherhood combined with compromised operational security and media attention. Her former colleagues in the Deep Cover program were being reassigned or relocated, as federal agencies assessed the potential compromise to other operatives. Some operations were being terminated entirely due to concerns that hostile intelligence services might have identified patterns or connections that could expose additional assets. Samantha's dramatic rescue had created ripple effects throughout the intelligence community that would take years to fully understand. The tattoo across her shoulder blades, which had remained hidden beneath custodial uniforms for 8 months, was now being photographed and analyzed by federal investigators who needed to document every aspect of her background and capabilities. The coordinates and symbols that had once been private reminders of classified achievements were becoming evidence in official reports that would be stored in government databases indefinitely. Financial support from victim assistance programs was available but inadequate for someone whose situation didn't fit standard categories. Samantha wasn't technically a crime victim, though her life had been destroyed by criminal activity. She wasn't a traditional veteran seeking employment assistance, though her military background was her primary qualification for civilian work. The bureaucratic systems designed to help people in crisis weren't equipped to handle someone with her unique circumstances. Isabella's resilience was remarkable, but heartbreaking as she adapted to circumstances that no child should have to experience. Her questions about why they couldn't go home, why her mother seemed sad all the time, and why people kept saying they needed to be careful, revealed a maturity that had been forced upon her by events she couldn't understand. The innocence of childhood was being sacrificed to the requirements of operational security. The Academy personnel who had been saved by Samantha's intervention were struggling with their own complex emotions about the revelation. Gratitude for their survival was complicated by the knowledge that someone had been watching them for months without their awareness, evaluating their facility's vulnerabilities while maintaining a facade of humble service. The trust they had placed in background checks and security procedures had been revealed as inadequate. Legal complications were emerging as federal prosecutors tried to determine how to handle evidence and testimony from an operation that had involved classified personnel and methods. Samantha's actions had been unquestionably heroic and legally justified, but the techniques she had used and the equipment she had possessed raised questions about the authority under which she had been operating. The legal system wasn't designed to handle cases involving deep cover operatives. Her handlers were conducting exit interviews that felt more like debriefings from hostile territory, documenting lessons learned and operational security failures while planning damage control measures. The questions were professional but impersonal, treating her exposure as a tactical problem to be managed rather than a human tragedy involving a mother and child whose lives had been irreparably altered by service to their country. The prospect of normal employment seemed increasingly impossible, as background checks would inevitably reveal inconsistencies between her official records and her actual capabilities. Employers would discover gaps in her employment history that couldn't be explained, references that couldn't be contacted, and skills that exceeded anything her documented experience could justify. The resume of Samantha Rivera, custodial worker, bore no resemblance to the capabilities of Staff Sergeant Samantha Rivera, Special Operations veteran. Support groups for veterans transitioning to civilian life weren't equipped to help someone whose military service remained largely classified and whose recent experiences couldn't be discussed openly. The isolation of maintaining operational security was being replaced by the different but equally challenging isolation of being someone whose true story couldn't be shared with the people who might understand it best. The house that she and Isabella had called home for 8 months was now considered a security risk, forcing them to abandon belongings, relationships, and routines that had provided the illusion of normal life. Everything familiar was being stripped away as federal agencies worked to ensure their safety in an uncertain future that offered no guarantees of stability or happiness. 18 months after the Phoenix Police Academy incident, Samantha Rivera stood before a classroom of federal agents at the FBI Training Academy in Quantico, wearing an instructor's uniform that bore her real name for the first time in nearly a decade. The transition from invisible custodial worker to recognized expert in counterterrorism operations had been painful and complicated, but it had ultimately led to a new purpose that honored both her sacrifices and her capabilities. The hostage rescue and crisis response program that she now directed had been created specifically to address the intelligence failures that had made the Phoenix attack possible. Federal agencies had recognized that traditional security assessments were inadequate against sophisticated threats, and they needed instructors who understood both the operational realities of deep cover work and the tactical requirements of responding to professional terrorist cells. Isabella, now 8 years old, attended a private school specifically designed for children of federal employees whose identities required protection. The adjustment had been difficult, but she was thriving in an environment where other students understood the complexities of having parents whose work couldn't be discussed openly. Samantha picked her up every afternoon at exactly 3:30 p.m., maintaining the kind of routine that had been impossible during their months in protective custody. The academy personnel who had been saved during the gymnasium rescue had become unexpected advocates for Samantha's new career. Director Patterson served on the advisory board for her training program, while Captain Morgan regularly spoke at conferences about the importance of recognizing hidden assets in civilian environments. Professor Sullivan had written extensively about the psychological impact of discovering that someone you'd barely noticed possessed extraordinary capabilities. Lieutenant Martinez had become one of Samantha's closest friends, their relationship evolving from the awkward dynamics of unknown custodial worker and faculty member to genuine respect between professionals who understood the demands of serving others. Their conversations often focused on the strange paths that brought people together and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating someone's potential contributions. The training program that Samantha developed emphasized the kind of situational awareness and threat recognition that could have prevented the Phoenix attack from reaching its final stages. Federal agents learned to identify signs of surveillance, recognize professional-level operational planning, and coordinate responses between multiple agencies without the communication failures that had nearly resulted in catastrophe. Her instruction methods drew heavily from real-world experience, using case studies from her own classified missions to illustrate tactical principles that couldn't be learned from textbooks or simulations. The students didn't know the specific details of her background, but they recognized the authority that came from someone who had survived situations that existed only in their worst-case scenario planning. The Phoenix Police Academy had implemented security protocols based on lessons learned from the attack, with Samantha serving as a consultant during the development phase. The building now featured monitoring systems that could detect the kind of systematic surveillance that had preceded the assault, and staff members were trained to recognize behavioral patterns that might indicate hostile reconnaissance. Isabella's questions about her mother's work had evolved from confused fear to proud curiosity, as she grew old enough to understand that some jobs involved protecting people in ways that required secrecy. Samantha had learned to answer honestly within the limits of operational security, helping her daughter understand that service to others sometimes required personal sacrifices but ultimately made the world safer for everyone. The financial stability that came with her new position allowed them to establish the kind of normal life that had been impossible during her deep cover assignment. They lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where Isabella could have friends and participate in activities without the constant security concerns that had dominated their previous existence. The balance between professional responsibilities and personal relationships remained delicate, but it was manageable. Media interest in the Phoenix incident had eventually subsided as other stories captured public attention, but Samantha's role in preventing the attack had become part of federal law enforcement legend. Her story was told in classified briefings and training sessions as an example of how prepared individuals could make the difference between success and catastrophe when traditional security measures failed. The deep cover program that had defined her adult life had been restructured based on lessons learned from her exposure, with better coordination between agencies and improved support systems for operatives transitioning back to acknowledged identities. Her experience had revealed gaps in the program's design that could have endangered other agents, leading to reforms that would protect future generations of covert personnel. Speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences had become a regular part of her responsibilities, though she always spoke about tactical principles rather than specific operational details. Audiences were fascinated by someone who had lived invisible among them for months, before revealing capabilities that exceeded their own training, and her presentations consistently received the highest evaluation scores. The tattoo across her shoulder blades no longer needed to remain hidden, and she occasionally wore clothing that allowed the airborne wings and mission coordinates to be visible. The symbols had become conversation starters with other veterans, who recognized the significance of the markings, and understood the pride that came with earning them in hostile territory. Relationship counselors had helped her process the anger and resentment that had accompanied her forced exposure, teaching her to focus on the lives that had been saved rather than the life that had been lost. The work was ongoing, but she had learned to find satisfaction in her current role rather than mourning the career that circumstances had forced her to abandon. Her students at Quantico often asked about the psychology of maintaining deep cover for extended periods, curious about the mental discipline required to live as someone you weren't while remaining prepared for missions that might never come. Samantha's answers emphasized the importance of finding purpose in service regardless of whether that service was acknowledged or recognized by others. The Christmas card that arrived each year from the Phoenix Police Academy contained photographs and updates from the people whose lives she had saved, reminding her that her sacrifice had enabled 11 other people to continue their own stories. Director Patterson's retirement party, Captain Morgan's promotion, Professor Sullivan's published research, and Lieutenant Martinez's new training programs all represented continuations that wouldn't have been possible without her intervention. Isabella's bedtime conversations had evolved to include questions about heroes and service, with Samantha explaining that real heroes didn't always announce themselves or seek recognition for their actions. Sometimes the most important work was done by people who remained invisible until circumstances demanded their revelation, and sometimes the greatest service required giving up the very secrecy that made it possible. The quiet custodial worker who had mopped floors and emptied trash cans was gone forever, but in her place stood someone who could acknowledge her capabilities while using them to prepare others for the challenges that threatened innocent lives. Samantha Rivera had found a new way to serve, one that honored her past while building toward a future where hidden heroes might not need to remain hidden quite so long. Her story had become proof that extraordinary people existed in ordinary places, waiting for the moment when their skills would be desperately needed, and that sometimes the greatest victory was not the mission accomplished, but the life rebuilt afterward. 3 years after the Phoenix Police Academy incident, Samantha received an unexpected phone call that would force her to confront the most painful aspect of her transformation, from invisible operative to public figure. The caller identified himself as Marcus Chen, a documentary filmmaker who had been investigating the attack for a television series about domestic terrorism and heroic responses. His request was simple but devastating. He wanted to interview her about the night that had changed everything. The documentary project had already interviewed Director Patterson, Captain Morgan, and several of the Academy personnel who had been saved during the gymnasium rescue. Their accounts painted a picture of impossible heroism performed by someone who had appeared from nowhere and disappeared back into mystery. Marcus explained that the story felt incomplete without her perspective, and he believed the public deserved to understand how ordinary people could possess extraordinary capabilities. Samantha's initial response was an immediate refusal. The carefully constructed life she had built with Isabella depended on maintaining some distance from the events that had exposed her identity. Federal agencies had advised against any media appearances that might compromise ongoing security measures or provide hostile intelligence services with additional information about American counterterrorism capabilities. Her story was supposed to remain partially classified indefinitely, but Marcus persisted with arguments that gradually wore down her resistance. He pointed out that incomplete narratives about the Phoenix incident were already circulating online, filled with speculation and conspiracy theories that painted her as everything from a government super soldier to a foreign agent who had been conducting surveillance on American law enforcement. The truth, he argued, was being obscured by fiction that could ultimately prove more damaging than honest disclosure. Isabella, now 10 years old and more aware of her mother's unique situation, had been asking increasingly sophisticated questions about why their story couldn't be told openly. She understood that her mother had saved people, but she also sensed the isolation that came from being unable to share that pride with friends whose parents had normal jobs with straightforward explanations. The documentary represented an opportunity to provide some clarity about their unusual circumstances. The negotiation process took months, involving federal attorneys, public relations specialists, and security analysts who needed to determine what aspects of Samantha's story could be revealed without compromising ongoing operations or endangering other deep cover personnel. Every detail had to be evaluated for its potential impact on national security, from the specific tactics she had used during the rescue to the broader implications of acknowledging the deep cover program's existence. Ho Kras, Marcus proved surprisingly patient with the bureaucratic complexity, working with government officials to develop a framework for the interview that would satisfy both journalistic integrity and security requirements. His research into the Phoenix attack had been thorough enough to demonstrate that he understood the sensitivity of the subject matter and could be trusted to handle classified information responsibly. The Phoenix Police Academy had evolved significantly since the attack, implementing security measures and training protocols that reflected lessons learned from the incident. Director Patterson's successor, Commander Sarah Williams, had embraced transparency about the facility's vulnerabilities and the importance of recognizing hidden assets in civilian environments. The academy now served as a model for other law enforcement training facilities across the country. Samantha's decision to participate in the documentary was influenced by her work at Quantico, where she had seen how powerful authentic stories could be in training federal agents to recognize and respond to sophisticated threats. Her students consistently responded more effectively to case studies based on real events than to theoretical scenarios, suggesting that her story might serve educational purposes that justified the personal risks of exposure. The interview was conducted at the FBI Training Academy in a classroom that had been cleared of sensitive materials and swept for recording devices. Marcus arrived with a minimal crew, understanding that the location and circumstances required unusual discretion. Samantha wore her instructor's uniform, a deliberate choice that emphasized her current role rather than her controversial past. Her answers were carefully measured, focusing on tactical decisions and training principles, rather than specific operational details that remained classified. She described the psychological challenges of maintaining deep cover for extended periods, the importance of situational awareness in identifying threats, and the split-second decision-making that crisis situations demanded. The conversation felt like an extension of her teaching responsibilities. Marcus asked about the personal cost of her revelation, and Samantha found herself speaking more honestly than she had expected about the isolation, financial insecurity, and relationship challenges that had followed her exposure. Isabella's adaptation to their changed circumstances, the loss of anonymity that had defined her adult life, and the difficulty of rebuilding an identity after years of carefully constructed invisibility. The most powerful moment of the interview came when Marcus asked about the tattoo that had given the documentary its title. Samantha explained the significance of the airborne wings and mission coordinates, describing how each symbol represented lives saved and objectives accomplished in hostile territory where failure meant death for American personnel. The tattoo was a private record of service that had never been intended for public display. Isabella watched the interview from the observation room, seeing her mother in a professional context for the first time and beginning to understand the complexity of the woman who picked her up from school every day. The experience was educational for both of them, providing Isabella with context for their unusual life while helping Samantha articulate aspects of her experience that she had never discussed openly. The documentary's release 6 months later created a media sensation that exceeded everyone's expectations. Samantha's story resonated with audiences who were fascinated by the concept of hidden heroes living ordinary lives while possessing extraordinary capabilities. The program won several journalism awards and generated discussions about the role of classified personnel in domestic security operations. More importantly for Samantha, the documentary helped establish her credibility as an instructor and consultant, leading to speaking opportunities and training contracts that enhanced her financial stability while advancing her professional goals. The controlled revelation of her story had actually strengthened her position rather than compromising it, demonstrating that sometimes visibility could be as powerful as invisibility. Bezos, the Phoenix Police Academy hosted a special screening of the documentary for current staff and recruit classes, using Samantha's story as a teaching tool about threat recognition and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating people's potential contributions. The event served as both education and healing, helping everyone process the trauma of the attack while celebrating the heroism that had prevented tragedy. Isabella's pride in her mother's accomplishments became openly expressed for the first time, as she could finally share with classmates and friends the true reason for their unusual lifestyle and security precautions. The documentary had given her a way to explain their circumstances without revealing details that remained classified, providing the kind of normal social interaction that had been impossible before. 5 years after the Phoenix Police Academy attack, Samantha stood in the mirror of her bedroom, carefully applying concealer to the faded scars on her shoulder blades, remnants from a training accident in Afghanistan that had nearly ended her military career before it truly began. Tonight was different from any other evening in recent memory. She was preparing for the annual Law Enforcement Heroes Gala in Washington, D.C., where she would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her actions during the Academy incident. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same tattoo that had once needed to remain hidden beneath custodial uniforms would tonight be partially visible in the formal gown that Isabella had helped her select. The airborne wings and mission coordinates would be displayed in a ballroom filled with the highest levels of American government, law enforcement, and military leadership. What had once been her most closely guarded secret was becoming a symbol of service that transcended traditional boundaries. Isabella, now 12 and possessing the poise that came from years of navigating complex social situations, had been invited to attend the ceremony as Samantha's guest. The young girl who had once been confused by federal protection details was now articulate about her mother's unique career path and proud of the recognition being bestowed. Her presence at the gala represented the integration of Samantha's public and private identities that had taken years to achieve. The weeks leading up to the ceremony had been filled with interviews, background briefings, and security assessments that reminded Samantha of her original military clearance process. Federal agencies were using the medal presentation as an opportunity to publicly acknowledge the deep cover program's existence while maintaining operational security around its current activities. Her story was becoming a recruiting tool for future generations of covert operatives. President Katherine Morrison had personally requested the meeting with Samantha that would occur before the public ceremony, expressing interest in understanding how the deep cover program functioned and whether similar initiatives should be expanded to address evolving security threats. The conversation would be classified, but its existence demonstrated the level of attention that Samantha's actions had attracted at the highest levels of government. Director Patterson, now retired but serving as a security consultant for federal agencies, had been instrumental in nominating Samantha for the presidential recognition. His advocacy had emphasized not just the immediate lives saved during the Phoenix attack, but the broader implications of her service and the intelligence failures that her presence had prevented. The medal represented acknowledgement of sacrifices that extended far beyond a single night's heroism. The Phoenix Police Academy had become a case study in institutional transformation, with security protocols and threat recognition training that served as models for law enforcement facilities nationwide. Commander Williams regularly hosted delegations from other agencies who wanted to understand how the academy had evolved from vulnerability to resilience. Samantha's story was central to these presentations, though her personal details remained protected. Marcus Chen's documentary had spawned a series of follow-up investigations into the Deep Cover program and its role in domestic security operations. While most operational details remained classified, the public acknowledgement of the program's existence had led to congressional oversight and budget allocations that strengthened its capabilities. Samantha's exposure had actually enhanced the program rather than compromising it. The training curriculum that Samantha had developed at Quantico was being implemented across multiple federal agencies, creating standardized approaches to threat recognition and crisis response that addressed the coordination failures evident during the Phoenix incident. Her methods emphasized the importance of looking beyond obvious indicators to identify sophisticated threats that traditional security measures might miss. Lieutenant Martinez had been promoted to captain and now served as liaison between local law enforcement and federal agencies for counterterrorism operations in the Southwest. Her friendship with Samantha had evolved into professional collaboration, with both women serving on advisory committees that shaped policy for protecting critical infrastructure. Their relationship exemplified the kind of cooperation that prevented intelligence failures. The evening of the gala, Samantha and Isabella arrived at the White House in a government car that represented the kind of official recognition that had been impossible during her deep cover years. Isabella wore a navy blue dress that complemented her mother's formal attire, and both carried themselves with the confidence that came from years of navigating high-security environments where protocol and discretion were essential. President Morrison's private meeting with Samantha lasted 45 minutes and covered topics ranging from the psychological challenges of deep cover work to the strategic value of placing trained operatives in civilian positions. The president expressed particular interest in Samantha's assessment of current threats and her recommendations for enhancing domestic security without compromising civil liberties or democratic institutions. The formal ceremony took place in the East Room before an audience that included the Joint Chiefs of Staff, congressional leadership, and representatives from every major law enforcement and intelligence agency. When President Morrison read the citation accompanying the Presidential Medal of Freedom, her words acknowledged not just Samantha's actions during the Phoenix attack, but her years of invisible service and the personal sacrifices that duty had required. Isabella watched from the front row as her mother received recognition that had been decades in the making, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full scope of what her mother had given up to serve others. The ceremony represented validation of choices that had shaped both their lives in ways that were only now becoming clear. The reception following the medal presentation brought together Academy personnel who had been saved during the gymnasium rescue, federal officials who had worked on the subsequent investigation, and military colleagues who had served alongside Samantha during her combat deployments. Many were meeting in person for the first time, despite their shared connection to events that had redefined their understanding of service and sacrifice. Captain Morgan, now Chief of Police in a major metropolitan department, delivered remarks that emphasized how the Phoenix incident had changed his approach to evaluating personnel and recognizing hidden capabilities in unexpected places. His words reflected a broader transformation in law enforcement, thinking about the value of diverse backgrounds and unconventional experience in addressing modern security challenges. Professor Sullivan had completed her research on the psychological impact of discovering extraordinary capabilities in ordinary people, and her findings were being used to develop training programs that helped personnel recognize and appropriately utilize hidden assets in crisis situations. Samantha's story had become the foundation for academic research that was influencing policy development across multiple agencies. The evening concluded with Samantha and Isabella dancing together while the Marine Corps band played patriotic music that had special meaning for someone who had served in uniform and continued serving in civilian clothes. The moment represented the integration of all aspects of Samantha's identity: soldier, mother, hero, and teacher. As the final notes of America the Beautiful echoed through the East Room, Samantha looked down at the Presidential Medal of Freedom resting against her formal gown, its weight both symbolic and real. The Airborne tattoo on her spine, visible through the dress's elegant back design, had completed its journey from hidden secret to public symbol of service. Isabella squeezed her mother's hand as they walked toward the exit, passing portraits of presidents and patriots who had shaped the nation they had both served in their own ways. Tomorrow, they would return to their quiet life in Virginia, where Samantha would continue training the next generation of federal agents, and Isabella would attend 7th grade like any other 12-year-old. But tonight had proven that invisible heroes exist all around us, cleaning our buildings, teaching our children, serving our coffee, carrying extraordinary capabilities beneath ordinary appearances. The custodial worker who saved 11 lives had become a symbol of hidden potential that exists in unexpected places, waiting for the moment when courage demands revelation. "Mom," Isabella whispered as they reached the limousine, "I finally understand why you always taught me to notice the quiet people." Samantha smiled, remembering her own words from years of bedtime conversations. The most important people are often the ones nobody sees coming. As their car pulled away from the White House, Samantha realized that some stories end not with secrets finally revealed, but with the understanding that heroism wears many disguises, and the person sitting next to you might just be extraordinary. What do you think? Are there invisible guardians in your workplace, your school, your community right now? Heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they're the quiet ones in the back, hoping they'll never be needed, but ready to save everyone when they are. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that extraordinary courage lives in ordinary places. Drop a comment below and tell us about the unsung heroes in your life. And remember, you never know who might be watching over you.